Wolverine was in a fight? Wait, let me guess. Wolverine won. How do I know? It's Wolverine. March 7th, 1941. Late last year, Germany, Italy, and Japan gained a number of new European allies. And this week, one more joins the fold. This week, Bulgaria joins the Axis powers. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, British and Commonwealth forces were advancing through Italian Somaliland on two fronts. The USSR was discussing what to do in case of a German invasion, and the Germans began building bridges. Yep, bridge construction to bring German units in force into Bulgaria began as last week ended, and this one begins. The first German unit to cross the Bulgarian border from Romania is an anti-aircraft battalion, back on the 28th, heading for Varna. On March the 1st, Bulgaria officially joins the Tripartite Pact and the Axis powers at a ceremony in Vienna. Tsar Boris had refused to do so until German forces were actually on Bulgarian soil, as he was worried about the Turkish and Soviet reactions. At the ceremony, though, Bulgarian Prime Minister Bogdan Filov says that Bulgaria will stick by its word to its neighbors: friendship treaties with Turkey and Yugoslavia, and a non-aggression pact with Greece. However, on March the 2nd, the Bulgarian government closes its borders with Turkey, Greece, and Yugoslavia, and all outgoing telegraph and telephone communication is stopped by German agents. Road repair and road maintenance crews are sent into Bulgaria just ahead of German troops, units of Wilhelm List's 12th Army, who officially enter their new Allies territory March 2nd, 1941 at 6 a.m. The 8th Air Corps moves in and is soon established at airfields near Sofia and Plovdiv. As for the international reaction, it is generally pretty mild. Britain, of course, breaks off diplomatic relations with Bulgaria, but Germany still does not break them off with Greece. Turkey does immediately close the Dardanelles, and on the 4th, Hitler sends a message to Turkish President İsmet İnönü that the German entry into Bulgaria is something they just have to do because of the British sending planes and things into Greece. Don't worry, he has peaceful intentions to Turkey, and German troops will remain at least 50 kilometers from the Turkish border. And so the occupation of Bulgaria proceeds apace. On the 4th, Adolf Hitler meets with Yugoslavian Prince Regent Paul secretly at Berchtesgaden to try to get him to also join the Axis. When Paul returns home, he realizes he kinda has to choose between Germany or Britain, and Britain doesn't seem to have much to offer. Yugoslavia is also now basically surrounded by Axis powers and Greece, with whom Italy is at war. Britain is sending troops to Greece, though, not to deal with the Italians, which the Greeks are doing pretty well by themselves, but in case of German invasion. On the 4th, Lieutenant General Henry Jumbo Wilson, to command those troops, arrives in Greece. The Greeks insist that Wilson remain incognito and in the embassy to not provoke the Germans. But the German consulate overlooks the port of Piraeus, which is where all the British troops will land. So, March 5th, Operation Luster, bringing the British forces to Greece, begins under Italian air attacks. Every 3 days, a convoy will leave Egypt. The Italians will eventually sink 25 ships, but 18 of those happen in port after the troops have disembarked. 60,364 men will be ferried across, 4 divisions, 2 of them armored. On March the 7th, the first British troops land in Greece at the port of Piraeus. But it is not just Greece, but also the USSR that Germany plans to attack. Lawrence Deinhard, American ambassador in Moscow, tries to meet with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov to give him this message: the government of the United States, while endeavoring to estimate the developing world situation, have come into the possession of information which it regards as authentic, clearly indicating that it is the intention of Germany to attack the Soviet Union. Before he can do this, though, American Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles gives the info to the Soviet ambassador in Washington, D.C. On the 5th, Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Tokyo, sends Moscow microfilm of a telegram from German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop to the German ambassador to Japan, Eugen Ott, giving the likely date of the attack on the Soviet Union. Also on the 5th, Adolf Hitler issues Directive 24 on cooperation with Japan. This basically aims to get Japan into active war with Britain as soon as possible to tie up the British Navy in the Pacific. Now, he is not the only one issuing directives this week. On the 6th, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill issues the Battle of the Atlantic Directive. This forms the Battle of the Atlantic Committee and is to immediately strengthen forces and monitor progress. The committee is to bring about better coordination between political, military, and scientific leaders and activities. This month's eventual total loss of over 500,000 tons of shipping is comparable to the worst days of World War I. But Allied convoy escorts will sink 6 German U-boats, a fifth of their operational fleet. One of those sinkings happens this week on the 7th, as the British destroyer Wolverine sinks U-47. This is major news, because that sub is captained by the legendary submarine ace Günther Prien, who we've seen before. Prien is not only the first member of the whole Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, to receive the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves. He has sunk over 30 Allied ships, including the totally legendary feat of sinking the British battleship Royal Oak at anchor in Scapa Flow, as we saw in the first weeks of the war, in one of the most daring submarine feats of all time. Okay, Prien and his sub and crew are not officially sunk. They just disappear and are presumed sunk by the Wolverine and are never, ever, ever seen again. Germany will not announce the disappearance of this major national hero until May, though, when they kind of have to do so after repeated British propaganda broadcasts ask again and again, where is Prien? Where is Prien? Hey, where is Prien? Well, the British are trying a daring feat of their own this week in German-occupied Norway. On March 4th comes a British commando raid in Norway on the Lofoten Islands, inside the Arctic Circle. This is Operation Claymore, and it's undertaken by over 500 men and 7 ships. They sink 10 ships and take over 200 German prisoners. 300 Norwegian volunteers are also taken to Britain. The thing is, the Germans make heavy punishment reprisals on the locals afterwards, so a lot of the Norwegian resistance members do not approve of raids like this. The aim of the raid is to capture an Enigma machine used by the Kriegsmarine, whose codes, unlike those of the Luftwaffe, are seemingly impossible to break. There is one aboard the armed trawler Krebs, but the commander manages to throw it overboard before he's killed and the ship sunk. But he is not able to destroy his coding documents and a set of Enigma rotor wheels, which are sent to Bletchley Park for British intelligence to work on. Josef Terboven, Reichskommissar in Norway, sets up a punishment court, and the farms of saboteurs are to be burned. Nazi Minister of Propaganda Josef Goebbels writes that Terboven knows his business. There is action in the field this week too, down in various parts of Africa. On the 1st, Kufra in southeast Libya falls after being under siege by a French free force coming from Chad with assistance from the British Long-Range Desert Group. Over in Italian Somaliland, the advance of the 12th African Division continues, taking Lug Ferrandi III and Dolo V. But the real progress this week is the advance from Mogadishu, which fell last week. Over the 7 days of this week, from Mogadishu to Gabredare, the Nigerian advance covers nearly 700 kilometers. Thing is, the initial advance into Jubaland was helped by having advanced dumps for gasoline, ammunition, stuff like that. But of course, that is no longer possible the further they go. So what do they do now? Well, now they have the ports of Kismayu, Merka, and especially Mogadishu. They had been sabotaged, sure, but not that thoroughly, so they were quickly put back into operating order. The Nigerians have 350,000 gallons, that's 1.3 million liters, of water and gasoline taken in Mogadishu. Here is a rather poetic quote from the Abyssinian campaigns about the remarkable Nigerian advance. They took the route that Graziani had followed to the Ogaden Plateau. Every 10 miles, a flamboyant kilometer post bore the name of some celebrated general who had helped to create the empire. And every 3 miles, an overturned Italian lorry bore witness to the collapse of his works. They swept past the rather embarrassed-looking fascist eagle, which stands in the main street at Bulo Berti. They passed the house, where the Italians had improvised defenses out of old Chianti bottles. The Strada Imperiale had faded out, but the roads grew rapidly worse. But the Nigerians never paused. They swept across a waste of featureless white desert, past the broken statue of Mussolini, which, chinless and bullet-riddled, stands in this desert like the bust of Ozymandias, king of kings. Somebody at the British Ministry of Information seriously missed his calling as a poet, because that is good shit. What do you guys think? That was good, right? Is he? Yeah? I think that's great. Okay, anyhow. That observation is going to bring us to the end of this week. A week that sees commando action in the far north, bridge building in the southeast, and the loss of a submarine ace. And German troops are pouring into Bulgaria, and British troops are pouring into Greece, and Britain and Germany are at war with each other, and Greece is at war with Italy. What could possibly go wrong? Greece is now far more worried about what might come from the north than from the east. But if you'd like to see some Greek military history, specifically war with Turkey, here's our Between Two Wars double episode about the Greco-Turkish War. It's very, very good, and it will be there in just a second. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Matt136. It is only thanks to people like Matt136 or 136. Wonder if that's your inmate number. Anyway, it's thanks to people like you that we can actually make this content. So if you like all of this, please join the army and support us at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And do not forget to subscribe and ring that bell. See you next time.